It started out as just another quiet afternoon. I was over at my neighbor's house, helping out with some yard work, something I had done countless times before. Mrs. Thompson, or Claire as she insisted I call her, had always been kind to me. She and my mom were close friends, and she'd practically watched me grow up. Her son, Jason, was my age, and we had spent countless summers together playing basketball in their driveway or swimming in their pool. But today was different. Jason was out of town for a few days, off on a weekend trip with his girlfriend, so it was just me and Claire. We'd finished up the work in the yard, and I was about to head home when she stopped me, her hand gently catching my arm. "Stay for a bit," she said with a smile, her voice warm and inviting. "I'll make us some lemonade, and we can sit in the kitchen for a while. You must be thirsty after all that work." There was something in her tone, something I couldn't quite place, but it made my heart skip a beat. I hesitated for a moment, but then I found myself nodding. Sure, that sounds great. Claire's kitchen was always immaculate, bright and airy, with soft yellow curtains framing the windows. I'd spent plenty of time here over the years, chatting with her while she baked or cooked, but today the air felt heavier, more charged. As I sat at the small kitchen table, I watched her move about the room with practiced ease, pulling lemons from the fridge, sugar from the pantry. Her movements were graceful, each one deliberate, and for the first time I noticed how beautiful she was. Not in the way you notice a movie star or a stranger passing by, but in a quieter, more familiar way. The way her hair, streaked with just a hint of silver, framed her face. The way her lips curved up into that soft smile that made you feel at ease. She caught me staring, and her smile widened just a little. "You've grown up so much," she said, her voice soft. "I still remember when you and Jason were just kids, running around this house like you owned the place." I chuckled, trying to shake off the strange feeling that was creeping over me. "Yeah, it's been a while, hasn't it?" Claire set the pitcher of lemonade on the table and sat across from me, her fingers lightly brushing mine as she handed me a glass. That brief contact sent a spark through me, and suddenly the space between us felt too small, too intimate. For a few moments, we sipped our drinks in silence, the quiet ticking of the kitchen clock filling the space. I could feel her eyes on me, and when I finally looked up, the look in her eyes made my pulse quicken. "I've always appreciated how kind you are," she said softly, her voice laced with something I couldn't quite identify. "You've always been so helpful, always willing to lend a hand. It's rare to find someone so thoughtful these days." I swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. "It's nothing, really. You've always been good to me, too." She reached across the table again, this time letting her fingers linger on mine. "It's not nothing," she whispered, her eyes locked on mine. There was something in her gaze, something vulnerable, yet undeniably intense that made my heart race. The air in the room seemed to shift, becoming thicker, charged with a tension that hadn't been there moments before. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening, but all I could focus on was the warmth of her hand on mine and the way her lips parted, just slightly, as she leaned in closer. I began, my voice barely audible, but she silenced me with a gentle squeeze of my hand. "Come here," Claire said, her voice soft but filled with quiet command. She stood, her fingers trailing lightly along my arm as she pulled me up with her. My legs felt shaky as I followed her into the kitchen, every nerve in my body suddenly on high alert. She stopped in front of the counter, turning to face me, her eyes searching mine. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room, but the tension between us was palpable, filling the space around us like a thick, invisible fog. "I've always thought you were special," she whispered, stepping closer, her hand now resting lightly on my chest. Her touch was so soft, so careful, yet it sent shockwaves through me. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to find the words, but nothing came. All I could do was stand there, frozen in place, as Claire's hand slid up to my shoulder, her fingers brushing lightly against my neck. "I know this is unexpected," she murmured, her breath warm against my skin. "But I can't pretend anymore. I've felt something between us for a long time. Haven't you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. My mind screamed at me to pull away, to step back before things went too far, but my body betrayed me. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare into her eyes as the distance between us disappeared entirely. Without warning, her lips were on mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as though she was testing the waters. But then it deepened, and all the tension that had been building between us for weeks, maybe even months, finally exploded. Her hands gripped my shoulders as she pulled me closer, and I found myself kissing her back with a hunger I didn't know I possessed. The world around us disappeared. It was just the two of us, tangled in a kiss that shouldn't be happening, and yet felt inevitable. My hand slid to her waist, pulling her closer, and I could feel her trembling against me. "Claire, we shouldn't," I managed to whisper between kisses, but the words were half-hearted. I didn't mean them, not really. "I know," she breathed, her lips brushing against my ear, "but I don't care." I didn't care either, not anymore. Not as her hands slid under my shirt, her fingers tracing the lines of my back. Not as I pressed her against the counter, my mouth finding hers again and again, each kiss more urgent than the last. The kitchen seemed to shrink around us, the space between us disappearing entirely as we gave in to the pull that had been building for so long. The kiss deepened, and everything else faded into the background: the kitchen, the world outside, the lingering echo of guilt that whispered in the back of my mind. It was all drowned out by the feel of Claire's body pressed against mine, the warmth of her skin, the way her hands gripped the back of my neck, pulling me closer. Her lips moved with an urgency that matched the pounding of my heart, each kiss sending shockwaves through me. There was no hesitation now, no second guessing. Just the overwhelming need to feel her, to be close to her, to lose myself in this moment that shouldn't be happening but felt inevitable. Claire pulled back slightly, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Her eyes searched mine, and for a moment I thought she might pull away, that the reality of what we were doing would hit her. But instead, she smiled soft, almost shy, and pressed her forehead against mine. "This is crazy," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but laced with a kind of breathless excitement. "I didn't mean for this to happen, but I can't stop now." I swallowed hard, my pulse still racing. "Neither can I admitted, my voice trembling with the weight of the confession. We stood there for a moment, our foreheads touching, the quiet hum of the kitchen, the only sound breaking the silence. It was as if we were both waiting for the other to say something, to stop this before it went too far. But neither of us did. Claire's fingers slid down my arm, her touch sending a shiver through me. She took my hand in hers, guiding it up to her face, pressing my palm against her cheek. Her skin was warm, soft, and as I ran my thumb along the curve of her jaw, I could feel her lean into the touch, her eyes fluttering closed. "I don't know what I'm doing," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly, "but I don't care." Before I could respond, she kissed me again, harder this time, more insistent. I didn't hesitate. I kissed her back, my hands sliding down her sides, pulling her even closer. The kitchen felt too small now, the air between us thick with tension and desire. Every touch, every movement felt electric, like we were on the edge of something that would change everything. She broke the kiss just long enough to take my hand again, pulling me with her as she backed toward the counter. Her eyes never left mine, and I could see the conflict there, the mixture of guilt and desire, of fear and excitement. But neither of us stopped. Neither of us wanted to. Claire reached the counter and turned, pressing her back against it as she pulled me closer, her hands gripping my shirt, her lips finding mine again. I could feel her body trembling, and I wasn't sure if it was from nerves or excitement, or maybe both. I knew I was shaking too, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Her hands slid up my chest, her fingers curling around the fabric of my shirt as she pulled me closer, and I found myself responding instinctively, my hands roaming her body, my lips trailing down her neck. She gasped softly, her head falling back as I kissed the soft skin just below her ear, and I could feel her fingers tighten their grip on my shirt, pulling me even closer. "This feels too good," she whispered, her voice breathless, her words tumbling out between kisses. "But we can't. We shouldn't." I pulled back just enough to look at her, my chest rising and falling with the force of my breaths. "Do you want to stop?" Her eyes flickered with something hesitation, maybe, but she shook her head, her lips parting as she exhaled softly. "No," she whispered. "I don't want to stop." That was all I needed to hear. My lips found hers again, and this time, there was no hesitation, no lingering uncertainty. I kissed her deeply, my hands sliding down to her waist, pulling her close enough that I could feel the heat of her body through the thin fabric of her blouse. Claire let out a soft moan, her fingers tangling in my hair as she pressed herself against me, and I felt something inside me snap. Any remaining doubts, any last threads of restraint, vanished in that moment. There was nothing left but the two of us, our bodies, our breaths, our shared need. Her hands were on my back now, pulling me impossibly closer, and I could feel her chest rising and falling rapidly against mine. I slid my hand up to the back of her neck, my fingers tangling in her hair as I deepened the kiss, losing myself in the feel of her, the taste of her. We were pressed so tightly together now that I could feel her heartbeat against my chest, could feel the way her body responded to every touch, every kiss. It was overwhelming, intoxicating, and I was helpless to stop it. The room spun around us, and for a moment I forgot where we were, forgot everything except the heat between us, the way her lips moved against mine, the way her hands gripped me like she was afraid to let go. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, Claire pulled away, gasping for breath. Her chest heaved as she looked up at me, her eyes wide, her lips slightly swollen from the intensity of our kisses. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of what we had just done hanging heavy in the air between us. She started, her voice shaky, but then she stopped, her eyes searching mine for some kind of reassurance, some kind of answer to the question neither of us had asked. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what this meant, or where we would go from here. All I knew was that we had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And now, standing here in the quiet of her kitchen, the reality of it was starting to sink in. "I'm sorry," Claire whispered, her voice breaking slightly as she looked down, her fingers trembling as she pulled her hands away from me. I reached out instinctively, catching her hand before she could pull away completely. "Don't apologize," I said softly, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. This wasn't a mistake." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and confusion. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I stepped closer, my hand still holding hers. "Neither do I said honestly, "but we'll figure it out." For a long moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. There were so many questions, so many uncertainties, but in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. What mattered was that we were here, together, and whatever came next, we would face it together. Claire took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around mine as she nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered, "we'll figure it out." I nodded, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "Together." Claire's hand remained in mine, and we stood there in the kitchen, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound between us. The tension that had been so palpable moments before lingered, but now it was mixed with a deep sense of uncertainty. Neither of us knew what this meant, what this sudden and undeniable shift in our relationship would bring. But at that moment, none of it seemed to matter. I could feel her fingers trembling slightly, and I knew she was just as overwhelmed as I was. Her gaze softened as she looked up at me, her expression filled with a mix of vulnerability and confusion. "Are you okay?" I asked gently, my thumb brushing across the back of her hand. It was a simple question, but I needed to know, needed to be sure she was all right. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine before she nodded slowly. "I think so," she whispered, her voice fragile. This wasn't supposed to happen." I could hear the guilt creeping into her voice, the weight of everything we had just done pressing down on her. And for a moment, I felt it too, that nagging voice in the back of my mind telling me we had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed, that this could complicate everything in ways neither of us were prepared for. But at the same time, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. The connection we had shared, the intensity of the moment felt too real, too powerful to be a mistake. "I don't regret it," I said quietly, my hand still holding hers. "Do you?" Claire's eyes flickered with something, an emotion I couldn't quite name, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she took a deep breath, her fingers curling tighter around mine as she shook her head. "No," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't regret it, but I'm scared." Her confession hit me harder than I expected, and I felt a knot tighten in my chest. She was vulnerable, conflicted, and I knew I had to tread carefully. This wasn't just about the kiss, it was about everything that came with it. The uncertainty, the risk of damaging our relationship, the consequences that neither of us had fully considered. "We don't have to figure it all out right now," I said softly, my voice calm despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. "Let's just take it one step at a time." Claire looked up at me, her eyes filled with both gratitude and fear. She nodded slowly, her grip on my hand relaxing slightly as she exhaled a shaky breath. One step at a time, she repeated, as if she was trying to reassure herself. I smiled gently, releasing her hand and stepping back, giving her some space. The intensity of the moment had passed, but the weight of what had happened still lingered in the air between us. "We'll figure it out," I promised, my voice steady. "Together." For the next few moments we stood there in the kitchen, the silence between us no longer tense but filled with a quiet understanding. Claire glanced at the clock on the wall and then back at me, a soft sigh escaping her lips. I should probably get back to preparing dinner," she said, her voice more composed now, though I could still hear the lingering tremor beneath her words. I nodded, offering her a small smile. "Yeah, I should probably head home too." There was an awkwardness between us now, a shift in the dynamic that neither of us knew how to navigate. But as I turned to leave, Claire reached out again, her fingers brushing lightly against my arm, stopping me in my tracks. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes meeting mine, "for understanding, and for not pushing me." I felt a warmth spread through me at her words, and I gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Of course," I replied. "I'll see you tomorrow." She nodded, her smile more genuine now. "Tomorrow." With that, I left, stepping out into the cool evening air, my mind still racing with everything that had just happened. The kiss, the confession, the way her touch had lingered on my skin, all of it played over and over in my head as I walked home, the reality of what we had done sinking in. I knew this wasn't going to be simple. There were too many layers, too many emotions involved for it to be anything but complicated. But despite the uncertainty, despite the fear that crept into the edges of my mind, I couldn't deny that something had shifted between us. Something that felt inevitable, even if we hadn't planned for it. That night, as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about Claire. The way she had looked at me, the softness in her eyes, the warmth of her touch. It had been more than just a kiss, it had been the culmination of something that had been building between us for a long time. Something neither of us had fully acknowledged until now. The next day, I found myself back at Claire's house, just as I had promised. We went about the day as if nothing had changed, but the tension between us was undeniable. Every glance, every touch felt more charged than before, and I could see the same conflict in her eyes that I felt in my own chest. We didn't talk about the kiss. We didn't talk about what it meant or where it would lead. But it was there, hanging in the air between us like an unspoken secret, waiting for one of us to acknowledge it. It wasn't until later that afternoon, when we were both in the kitchen again, that the tension finally broke. I had been helping Claire with some dishes, our movements careful, deliberate, as if we were both trying to avoid brushing against each other. But then, as I reached for a plate, our hands touched just briefly, just enough to send a jolt through both of us. We froze, our eyes locking, and in that moment, all the uncertainty, all the fear melted away. The pull between us was undeniable, and neither of us could resist it any longer. Without a word, I stepped closer, closing the distance between us. Claire didn't move, didn't stop me, and when I leaned in, pressing my lips to hers once again, she kissed me back with a desperation that matched my own. It was softer this time, slower, but no less intense. Her hands found their way to my chest, and I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her close. The world outside the kitchen disappeared, and all that mattered was the feel of her in my arms, the taste of her lips, the way she clung to me as if she never wanted to let go. And in that moment, I knew. This was no longer something we could deny. Claire's body molded against mine, the warmth between us rising like a tide that couldn't be turned back. Her lips were soft and sweet, each kiss deeper than the last, filled with a mix of longing and fear that mirrored my own. As I held her close, everything that had been left unspoken over the past few days seemed to dissolve, replaced by this undeniable connection between us. I kissed her slowly, savoring each moment as my hands roamed the curve of her waist. Claire's fingers tangled in my hair, and I could feel her trembling against me, not from hesitation but from the intensity of the emotions flowing between us. It was as if we had crossed into a space where time no longer existed, where the world outside had ceased to matter. But even in the heat of the moment, there was a voice in the back of my mind, a whisper reminding me of the consequences, the complications, the weight of what we were doing. I tried to push it aside, to lose myself in the warmth of her embrace, but it was impossible to ignore the truth. Claire pulled back, just slightly, her breath coming in short gasps. Her eyes met mine, wide and filled with that same mix of desire and uncertainty. Her hand came up to rest on my chest, her fingers trembling as they brushed lightly against my skin. "This is so much," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't expect any of this." I nodded, swallowing hard as I rested my forehead against hers, my arms still wrapped around her. "Neither did I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't want to stop." Her lips parted, her eyes searching mine for something reassurance, maybe, or permission to let herself go just a little further. But whatever it was, I could see the conflict in her gaze, the battle between what she wanted and what she knew was right. "We need to think about this," Claire said softly, her fingers still tracing the line in my chest. "About where this leads." She didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what she meant. The future we were carelessly stepping into. The possibility of hurting others, hurting ourselves if we let this go on. As much as I wanted to keep going, to ignore everything and lose myself in the heat of the moment, I couldn't deny that she was right. I took a deep breath, my hands sliding down to rest on her waist as I pulled back slightly, enough to put a small distance between us. The space felt too large, too empty after being so close to her, but it was necessary. "You're right," I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "We need to figure this out." Claire's eyes softened and she nodded, though I could see the same struggle mirrored in her expression. She reached up, her fingers lightly brushing against my cheek, and I leaned into the touch, savoring the warmth of her hand on my skin. "I didn't plan this," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "I never meant for this to happen." I caught her hand in mine, pressing it gently against my lips before lowering it between us. "I know, neither did I." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with all the unspoken words that neither of us knew how to say. We both stood there, caught between what we wanted and what we knew we couldn't have, and the weight of that realization was almost too much to bear. "We should take a step back," Claire said finally, her voice trembling as she spoke, "before this gets harder." I nodded, though every part of me rebelled against the idea of stepping away from her. But I knew she was right. This wasn't something we could rush into, not without thinking about the consequences, the complications that came with it. "Yeah," I agreed quietly, my heart heavy with the weight of the decision. "We need to take some time to figure out what this means." Claire's eyes were soft, filled with a kind of sadness that cut through me. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered. "I don't want to ruin what we have." I tightened my grip on her hand, pulling her close again, but this time without the urgency, without the heat of desire clouding my thoughts. I held her gently, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "You won't lose me," I promised. "We'll figure this out together." For a moment we just stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, as if holding on would make it easier to let go. The kitchen felt too quiet now, the weight of what we had done and what we hadn't done hanging in the air around us. Finally, Claire pulled back, her hand slipping from mine as she took a step away. "We need to be careful," she said softly, her eyes lingering on mine. "We need to be sure about what we want, before we take another step." I nodded, my heart heavy but my mind clear. "You're right." With one last glance, Claire turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there alone, the memory of her touch still burning on my skin. The house felt emptier now, the air cooler, and I knew that things would never be the same between us. As I left her house that day, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions: desire, guilt, confusion, but above all, there was the undeniable truth that something had changed between us. We had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. And while we had stopped before it went too far, the connection between us still lingered, waiting for a resolution that neither of us had the answer to. In the days that followed, Claire and I kept our distance. We saw each other, exchanged polite smiles and small talk, but the tension between us remained, a silent reminder of the moment we had shared in her kitchen. The kisses, the touches, those were things we couldn't take back. And while we hadn't fully crossed the line, we had come close enough to feel its pull, its weight. I didn't know where things would go from here. I didn't know if we would give in to the pull between us or if we would walk away, leaving the memory of that kiss behind us. But one thing was certain: we couldn't go back to the way things were. Claire was right. We needed to be careful. We needed to think. But the feelings were still there, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when we could no longer deny them. And until that moment came, all I could do was wait.